So I wanted to share with you the final version of the book that I've been working on. Now, previous conversations and videos that I've had were about sequencing, editing, making the project to begin with. So I thought it would be nice to show you what the final product actually looks like. This book, Hide Me in the Honeysuckle Patch, is what I like to call a photo booklet. So it's not a high-end photo book, but it's also a little nicer than a zine. And I think that there's room for a book like this in the marketplace, especially because there is such a big gap between a traditional zine and a very high-end, limited run, offset printed photo book. Now this was done digitally, and it's a staple bound or a saddle stitched book. Very simple, kind of like a magazine. I could have done perfect binding or this binding method. I chose this binding method because it's affordable, and also it allows you to have really flat spreads. And the way that this book is laid out, there are images across the gutter, so this is a much nicer way to see full bleed, what we used to call in the newspaper biz double truck images. So let's just walk through this and I'll show you what the final edit looks like. The outside cover is a recycled paper, so it's a little more matte in the finish. The image is of some honeysuckle that I've played around with to get that shade of yellow, even though the work is primarily black and white, or it is all black and white. The book opens with my neighbor, Joe. And then we start to move through and move into the lives of these children who are existing in this space. I made this work during the lockdown of the pandemic, or shortly before and after those times, and a lot of it was made without really knowing what was the best practices with who we were spending time with, our social interactions, things like that. And I wanted to try to exist in my daughter's world as much as possible, but also deal with my own anxiety of that time. And I don't know that I came to any final realizations as much as I tried to channel what I was feeling in those moments through making pictures. A lot of times that's how I kind of deal with my anxiety, is making pictures and trying to translate my emotional space into a visual space. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I guess the jury's out if that translates in this body of work. I just really connected with how, as a child, I remember running around in the woods and playing, and how every spring or summer when the honeysuckle would bloom, we would go out and taste it. And in this season, it was the first time I got to introduce my daughter, that's the neighbor kids, I got to introduce my daughter to honeysuckle, and it was really in full bloom in this season. And there was something about the honeysuckle that really stuck with me. Why was it such a important thing from my childhood? And as I did research, I learned that honeysuckle is actually an invasive vine. It chokes out other plants. It's more like a weed than it is a flower. As a kid, it seems like this magical, wonderful thing, but as an adult, you start to see it's not so pleasant of a thing to exist in nature, or at least in our area of the world. Again, I'm not a biologist by any means, but I think that narrative is really interesting to explore, of the perspective shift from being a child and what something appears to be as a child and what something appears to be as an adult. Now this book, the way in which I printed it is a very affordable option, and it's something that's been really important to me, is to make something that I think almost anyone could afford to buy. My last book was $65, and while I'm really happy with the way that book turned out, the printing is beautiful, they did a really great job. The reality is not everyone can afford something like that, and I wanted to make something that anybody could buy and collect or just enjoy, throw it in your backpack. I think that there's room in the photo book culture in between zines and high-end photo books for something a little nicer, like a softcover book. A few years ago, I found a copy of Gary Winogrand's The Animals, and it was a softcover book. Really, perfect bound, nothing extremely special necessarily in the object of the book, but I really loved the book, and it was really affordable, and even at the time, I imagine it was a very affordable book. And I know that a lot of artists probably would cringe knowing that I'm deliberately making certain sacrifices because the printing is pretty good, but it's not fantastic in this book. But I think that it's good enough to do justice to the work, while the trade-off is that it allows me to offer something that almost anyone can buy and have. And I think that if we're going to allow the photo book culture, or at least like using photo books as a means of sharing our art, then we need to allow others into that world and that market, not necessarily just photographers or just academics or just art-specific people with disposable income. And so part of my hope of doing this was just doing a test run to create some simple formulas for other people to use if you want to print your own book. Another benefit of doing it this way is I was able to purchase and produce the first 50 copies of this book completely out of pocket, and theoretically, if they sell, then I'll be able to print another small run of books. But since it's digital, I can just do 50 copies instead of having to do 350 or 500 copies like an offset book. Now, an offset book would be great, but again, that's many thousands of dollars that I would have to raise funds for or pre-sale, and I just wanted to try something a little more simple, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, if you like this work, you can get a copy of this on my website. Hopefully you'll like it, and that will be kind of a test of if something like this is something that people would want, something a little bit nicer than a zine, but not a full tilt high-end photo book. And I know a lot of people are doing that type of thing, but this is kind of my attempt at doing it as just one person doing all the work from beginning to end. This whole book I shot, edited, designed the whole thing myself, and just to see if I could. I really enjoy that process as the artist, and I love being a part of the whole thing. That's, I think, just as much a part of my acquisition process of making the pictures is really editing and sequencing and dealing with how the final form of the work is distributed out into the world or put out into the world. I think that if you release too much of that control to another editor, that can be problematic. And definitely, I'm not the best designer in the world, so it would probably be good to work with a designer for something like this. But I wanted to try something simple, something straightforward. And I hope that if you like this work, that you'll like the zine, or the photo booklet is what I call it. It's not a photo book. It's like a booklet. It's a photo booklet. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's silly, but that's what I'm calling these. They're photo booklets. If you enjoy it, share it with other people. I think they'll be affordable enough that you can give a copy to a friend. And hopefully this work will kind of move out into the world. That's my hope. It ends up in people's living rooms, on their bookshelves, in their backpacks, that kind of thing. So if you want a copy, head over to my website and you can grab a copy there. And if you have any questions, I would love to answer them or be helpful if you have questions about printing or producing photo books.